Provocation. Review of an unread book by Stanislaw. Translated from the German by the Spirit of Hegel. One expert remarked that it was a fortunate circumstance that this history of the genocide was written by a German, as another author would have drawn accusations of Germanophobia. I don't think it would have happened that way. The Göttingen anthropologist considers the fact that it was the Germans who wanted to bring about the final solution to the Jewish question in the Third Reich to be a secondary part of a process that is limited neither to the German murderers nor to the Jewish victims. Abhorrent things have often been written about modern man. However, our author has decided to settle accounts with this man once and for all, to nail him down so that he can no longer move. Aspernicus, a name that involuntarily brings to mind Copernicus, set himself, like his great predecessor in astronomy, the goal of bringing about a revolution in the anthropology of evil. The reader may judge for himself, based on a summary of both volumes, whether he succeeded. The first volume begins, as befits such a comprehensive undertaking, with a consideration of the prevailing conditions among animals. The author deals with predators that kill out of instinct in order to live. He emphasizes that a predator, especially a large one, never kills beyond its own needs and the needs of its companions or commensal animals. It is well known that every species of predator has such a companion, consisting of weaker animals that benefit from the leftover prey. Non-predators become aggressive only during the mating season. Exceptions include cases in which the fight between males competing for a female ends in the death of the rival. Killing for the sake of a dead animal is a very rare occurrence among animals. This phenomenon is most frequently observed among domestic animals. Things are different with humans. As chronicles report, since ancient times, wars have usually ended with the mass murder of the vanquished. The motives were generally practical. The victor also eliminated the offspring of the defeated enemy to be completely safe from future retribution. In ancient cultures, such massacres had a public, even ostentatious character, as baskets full of severed limbs and genitals were carried in triumphal processions as exhibits of victory. Nor did anyone in antiquity question this right of the victor. The decisive factor in whether the vanquished were killed or enslaved was purely practical consideration. Using extensive material, Aspernicus demonstrates how the introduction of certain restrictions gradually led to the development of rules of war. The codes of knights are a vivid example. Although such restrictions were ignored in civil wars, since it was far more dangerous to keep the internal enemy alive than the external enemy. This also explains why the Catholics persecuted the Cathars much more cruelly than the Saracens. The ever-increasing number of such restrictions ultimately led to agreements similar to the Hague Convention. Their core is that military success and the murder of the vanquished must be definitively separated. The former must under no circumstances entail the latter. This separation was seen as a step forward in the ethics of military art. Acts of genocide also occurred in modern times, but the archaic ostentatious character was as alien to them as the decidedly selfish interests of their perpetrators. At this point, Copernicus moves on to examine the rationalizations that have been put forward in various centuries to justify genocide. In the Christianized world, these rationalizations become a universal phenomenon. It must be added, however, that neither in the expeditions of the colonial period, nor in the slave hunts in Africa, nor even in the liberation of the Holy Land, was the intention of genocide directly at the forefront. Rather, it was about labor, about the squatters of the land. Consequently, the squatting of the indigenous peoples merely meant the removal of obstacles to the goal. However, in the chronology of genocides, one can detect a decline in selfish interest as a motivational component compared to the justification component, that is, an increasing preponderance of the immaterial over the material benefits of the perpetrators. Copernicus sees the massacre of Armenians carried out by the Turks during the First World War as a precursor to the genocide practiced under Hitler, since all the characteristics of modern genocide were already fully developed at that time. The massacre brought no significant benefit to the Turks, and at the same time its motives were shrouded in lies and hidden from the world as best they could be. For, according to the author, it is not genocide to court that gives the 20th century its character, but murder with a completely false justification, whose cause and consequences are concealed as completely as possible. The material benefit derived from the plundering of the victims was generally minimal, or even, as in the case of the Jews and the Germans, significant. The murder of the Jews represented a material and cultural loss in the balance sheet of the German state, as German authors demonstrated after the war using extensive material. Thus, in the course of history, a literal reversal of the initial situation occurred. The previously real military and economic benefits of genocide had since become more mere fiction, and for this very reason the need arose to invent entirely new justifications for the murderous practices. Had these justifications been given the force of compelling arguments, it would have been unnecessary to conceal from the world the mass execution of death sentences, which was carried out on these grounds. However, since the murders were carried out secretly everywhere, the justifications were obviously not even convincing for the genocide advocates. Copernicus notes that this is a striking diagnosis, but one that cannot be refuted in light of the facts. As the surviving documents show, National Socialism adhered to the following gradation in its genocide. Some of the executions were publicly announced to the subjugated peoples, who, like the Slavs, were to be decimated. However, the groups that were to be completely liquidated, such as the Jews and the Gypsies, were not informed of the executions in the same way. The more total the murder, the more it was shrouded in secrecy. As Copernicus examines this group of phenomena, using the method of successive penetrations, gradually penetrating the deeper motives of genocide. First, he maps Europe as a gradient running from west to east, extending from the pole of secrecy to the pole of publicity, or expressed in moral terms, from shameful to shameless murder. What the Germans undertook locally, secretly on a smaller scale, and hesitantly, in Western Europe, they did in the East on an ever-increasing scale, decisively, ever more ruthlessly and openly. The zone of barely concealed murders began at the borders of the annexed Polish territories, that is, in the general government. However, the further east one went, the more openly genocide became a norm to be applied without delay. Often Jews were murdered in their homes without isolating them in ghettos or transporting them to extermination camps. The author believes that this differentiation testifies to the hypocrisy of the genociders, who shied away from doing in the West what they did in the East, where they didn't even bother to maintain appearances. The program for the final solution to the Jewish question had various variants in its initial stages, differing in the intensity of cruelty, yet with an identical finale. As Copernicus rightly notes that a bloodless variant could have been realized, which would have been even more beneficial for the Third Reich in military and economic terms. The separation of the Jewish population by gender and their subsequent isolation in ghettos or camps. Although the Germans ignored political factors in choosing their course of action, they should at least have considered the factor of self-interest, which was undoubtedly present in this variant. A considerable number of trains used to transport the Jews from the ghettos to the extermination camps would have been available again for military purposes. At the same time, personal costs would have decreased, as simply monitoring the ghettos would have required far fewer resources than those required for immediate physical extermination. The burden on industry, which had to produce crematoria, human bone mills, Zyklon machines and other equipment essential for genocide would also have been reduced. The Jews, segregated by gender, would have died out within 40 years at the latest, considering how rapidly the ghetto population dwindled due to hunger, disease, and exhaustion resulting from forced labor. The pace of this indirect genocide was known to the staff responsible for the final solution in early 1942, and when their final decisions were made, they could still fully count on a German victory. Therefore, no factors other than the will to murder justified the bloody solution. As surviving documents show, the Germans also considered other methods, such as sterilization by X-rays, but in the end they opted for mass murder. For Germany's history, for the assessment of its guilt, and for post-war world politics, this specific method of genocide against the Jews was of no consequence, since the Third Reich was already burdened by war crimes that deserved only the harshest punishment, even without it. As surviving documents show, the Germans also considered other methods, such as sterilization by X-rays, but in the end they opted for mass murder. Anyone who exterminates a people through forced sterilization or segregation by gender is no less a criminal than someone who murders them. Yet for the psychology of crime, for the analysis of Hitler's doctrine, and for the theory of humanity, this makes a crucial difference. Himmler justified the genocide of the Jews to his subordinates by claiming it was necessary to exterminate them so that they could never again pose a threat to the German state. Assuming such a threat actually existed, the method of indirect genocide proved to be the more economically efficient in material, technical, and organizational terms. Himmler, therefore, lied to his people, and probably to himself as well. All of this was overshadowed by later events, when the Germans suffered defeats, when the Great Retreats began, and when attempts were made to erase the traces of the mass executions by burning the exhumed corpses. If the bloody genocide had only occurred then, one might have believed the claims of Himmler and Eichmann that fear of retaliation from the victors had driven them to murder. Since this was not the case, Himmler also lied when he equated the Jews with parasites to be eradicated, because parasites are not destroyed with the intention of inflicting torment upon them. In short, it wasn't just about the profit gained from the crime committed, but about the pleasure derived from carrying it out. After 1943, and probably even later, Hitler and his staff could still genuinely believe in Germany's victory, and no one sits in judgment over the victors. Therefore, it is very difficult to explain why the Nazis did not fully acknowledge the acts of genocide while they were being carried out, why they even disguised them in strictly secret documents with euphemisms like resettlement, which actually meant execution. As Spernicus argues that this duplicity reveals an attempt to deceive the public, an attempt that was bound to fail. The Germans wanted to be noble Aryans, the best Europeans, heroic victors, and yet they were nothing more than murderers of defenseless people. They proclaimed one thing and did another, hence the extensive vocabulary of renaming and falsification in the style of Arbeit macht frei, work makes you free, resettlement or final solution, all euphemisms for crime. It is precisely in this deceitfulness, according to the author, that despite all the aspirations of Nazism, the Germans' connection to the Christian culture is revealed, a culture by which they were so deeply influenced that, despite their best efforts, they could not completely ignore the gospel. In this cultural sphere, the author argues, one can indeed do anything, but one cannot yet say everything. This culture is an irrevocable fact, for if it were not so, the Germans would have had no inhibitions whatsoever about calling their deeds by their true names. The first volume of Horst Copernicus's work, entitled The Final Solution as Redemption, reveals an overview of recent attempts to portray the truth about the genocide in the Third Reich as a forgery and a lie fabricated by the victors to definitively destroy defeated Germany, even morally. But would such an undertaking, the ignoring of what had accumulated in the form of documentary footage, confessions, Nazi archives, bales of women's hair, mountains of prostheses for murdered cripples, and toys for murdered children, eyeglasses, and the furnaces of the crematoria, would such an attempt to ignore all this be anything other than a sign of madness? Could a sane person manage to dismiss the irrefutable evidence of crimes of forgery? But But if the problem were reduced to a psychiatric one, if the defenders of National Socialism were truly mentally ill, then Copernicus's work, which draws on American research into members of the Nazi Party, there to cite the diagnoses of experts who believe that one cannot deny the mental normality of neo-Nazis, even though psychopaths are more frequently found among them than in the general population, would be superfluous. Therefore, the problem cannot simply be dismissed as a matter limited to psychiatric prophylaxis, and consequently its investigation becomes a duty of a philosophy of humanity. Here, the author launches a polemic against philosophers of the Heideggerian type. He does not reproach him for his membership of the National Socialist Party, which the philosopher incidentally soon left, and considers it a mitigating circumstance that the genocidal consequences of National Socialism were not yet readily apparent in the 1930s. Mistakes were forgivable if they are followed by a change of erroneous viewpoints, and if actions arise from them that necessitate such a reversal. In this postulate, Copernicus considers himself quite a minimalist. He does not claim that Heidegger or others like him were obligated to publicly present themselves as protectors of the persecuted, and that because he failed to do so, he must be condemned for a lack of courage. Not everyone is born to perform heroic deeds, but the crucial point here is that Heidegger was a philosopher. Anyone who concerns himself with the nature of being human cannot silently accept the Nazi crimes, for if he was of the opinion that these crimes were situated in a lower order of being and were merely criminal in nature, exceptional only in their dimensions, which the power of the state had inflated, and that for the same reasons it was not appropriate for him to concern himself with them, the same reasons why philosophy disregards ordinary crimes in its investigations, because they fall within the realm of criminology. If he saw it that way, then he was either blind or a liar. If he failed to recognize the extra criminal significance of the crime, then he was either intellectually blind, a fool, and what kind of philosopher can such a person be, even if he is capable of splitting hairs 4 times over? But if he remained silent out of deceitfulness, then he violated his calling. Either way, he thus proves himself to be an accomplice to the crime, not, of course, in its planning and execution. Such an accusation would be a gross slander. He becomes an accomplice to the crime through omission, because he degrades the crime, declares it null and void, relegates it to the margins of supposedly more important problems, and assigns it, if any place at all, only a peripheral one in the order of things. A doctor who considers the signs of a deadly disease insignificant, who conceals the disease itself, its symptoms, or its consequences, is either a bad doctor or an accomplice of the disease. There is no third option. Anyone concerned with human health cannot ignore a deadly disease and exclude it from their research, and anyone who deals with the nature of human existence cannot simply banish genocide from this framework. If they do, they invalidate their own work. The fact that a man named Heidegger was accused of supporting the Hitler doctrine personally, but that this accusation was not also directed against his works, which are completely silent on this entire subject, testifies, in our author's opinion, to the existence of a conspiracy of accomplices, for all those who have agreed to minimize the significance of this crime in the hierarchy of human existence are complicit. National Socialism has given rise to many interpretations. The author of Genocide mentions 3 common variants among them: the gangster variant, the socio-economic variant, and the nihilistic variant. The first equates genocide with the activities of murderers and robbers. This variant was particularly emphasized during the Nuremberg trials because the tribunals established by the victors found it easiest to work with indictments that conformed to the traditional legal procedures used for ordinary crimes, and this was because the mountains of monstrous physical evidence, simply by their sheer existence, steered the proceedings in this direction. The socio-economic interpretation sees the weakness of the Weimar Republic, the economic crisis, and the temptations to which big business, caught between the forces of the left and the right, succumbed as a whole bundle of causes that facilitated Hitler's rise to power. National Socialism ultimately fascinated as a triumphant nihilism, especially great humanists like Thomas Mann, who saw in it the other voice in German history, the motif of diabolical temptation that he carried over from the Middle Ages through Nietzsche's apostasy into the 20th century in his novel Dr. Faustus. The three interpretations are only partially valid. The gangster variant disregards the profound mendacity of the Nazi movement. Gangsters in their machinations do not resort to euphemisms or lies that gloss over their crimes. The socio-economic interpretation fails to grasp the difference between Italian fascism and National Socialism, a difference that is by no means insignificant, for Mussolini was not the initiator of the genocide. Finally, Mann's conception is too vague in its thesis of equating Germany. The Nazi as a gangster is already a rather trivial simplification of the problem as a servant of the devil. He is a pathetic banality. The truth about National Socialism is neither as superficial nor as sublime as these two contrasting images suggest. The epistemological studies of National Socialism ended in a labyrinth of diagnoses that were partly accurate and partly undeniable, for its crimes are trivial on the surface, while their deeper meaning is perfidious. This deeper meaning did not inspire the leaders of the movement as long as they were nothing more than a handful of upstart beer hall politicians, but they did not become aware of it even later, after they had seized control of the machinery of the great state. As parvenus, hypocrites, and greedy opportunists who followed Hitler, they were incapable of self-awareness. As is known, quos Deus perdere vult, prius dementor. Whom God wishes to destroy, he first drives mad. Hitler's aggressive plan was not absurd from the beginning. It became so over time because it had to. As is known, the General Staff did not want a war with Russia, but if Hitler had triumphed in the East, the defeat of the Third Reich would only have been even more horrific. Generally speaking, due to the many factors of uncertainty, it is a questionable undertaking to design alternatives to reality. But the constellation on the world's chessboard at that time possessed such compelling logic that none of the partners could have escaped it. Hitler's military successes in the East would have forced the USA to launch atomic strikes against Japan before it received help from Germany. The atomic weapons thus revealed would have entangled the intercontinental antagonists, Germany and North America, in a nuclear arms race, which the Americans would have won due to their head start, and they would have had to exploit their initial superiority and lay waste to Germany with radioactive weapons in 1946 or 1947. That is, as long as theoretical physicists, decimated in Germany by Hitler, was still unable to supply his arsenal with nuclear weapons. As intercontinental ceasefire, or the division of the world into two spheres of influences, was out of the question because atomic weapons were involved, and the Americans would have acted suicidally if, in a state of war with the Germans, they had postponed their use until the completion of the German atomic bombs. Had the assassination attempt of July 20th, 1944, been successful, the extent of the destruction of Germany would have been less than it was after the surrender in 1945. However, if there had been no surrender at that time, Germany would have disintegrated into radioactive dust in 1946 or 1947. No American president could have refrained from such strikes, because none would have made a pact with an enemy who, like Hitler, trampled on all treaties, and who, moreover, already possessed the resources of Europe and Asia. That is to say, the catastrophe for Germany would ultimately have been all the worse, the greater its military success had been before. The catastrophe was preordained in Hitler's plans, for their expansionism knew no real limits, so it was only a matter of time before the successful strategy turned into a suicidal one. Cruel fate dictated that Hitler should drive out of Germany precisely those physicists through whose minds and hands the atomic bomb was built in the United States.